Well, on a scale of 1 to 10, how disappointed are you to see me just kind of sitting here after that super cool introduction? I really want to say thank you to our staff for creating it and for the kind of energy that we want to bring to all of our shows. In addition to shining the light on the unsung cyber heroes who toil in anonymity to keep us safe, our supporting kind of mission is to pivot this giant aircraft carrier of industry, the cybersecurity community and IT communities, which I liken to an aircraft carrier. It's very slow to kind of move in mass, but everything kinetic is going on and off and going crazy, all around the industry, which is, really what this is. And I want to help to kind of pivot the industry from fear, uncertainty, and doubt, FUD, to fun. Now, there's obviously plenty to be afraid of and uncertain of and doubtful of for sure, but we can still create an environment where we can kind of unleash a little bit of our inner child, have some fun, and still get very substantive. So speaking of substance, let me introduce our wonderful guest today, Sam Lichtenstein. Hey, Sam, how you doing?
Hey, Gary, I wouldn't get ahead of yourself, though, in saying that you're introducing the substance.
I think I mentioned to you that I'll do the humor and then you do the substance. That way we stay in our lanes, just generally.
Okay, it's a fair division of labor. I'll try to adhere to it.
Although I can testify to our audience, he's very funny, but he's also incredibly interesting. Sam, tell us a little bit about your origin story, those things that you can disclose.
So I'll confess my origin story doesn't have any major childhood trauma where I was bit by some sort of animal or came down from a foreign planet. No superhero origins, but for about 4.5 years, I worked within the intelligence community in the U.S. government. And since this past December, I've now switched back to the private sector to be back in New York with my family. And I'm now at Stratfor, a RAIN company, where I cover a variety of global security issues, including things like foreign malign influence, which I believe is what we're going to be discussing today.
Yeah, indeed. And so tell us a little bit about RAIN. Most people may not be familiar with what do the initials stand for?
Sure. So RAIN stands for Risk Assistance Network and Exchange. And the basic idea was that our founder felt that there was a missing part of the market that would convene various experts on all different sorts of topics regarding various risks that companies, organizations, and quite honestly, private individuals face, be they in the cyber realm, be they reputational, be they physical security, etc. And so we wanted to bring together one kind of common network where people could exchange advice, gather information, etc. And so RAIN last year acquired the company that I specifically work for, Stratfor. So we're now part of RAIN's community. And we focus on geopolitical analysis and intelligence. And so we are forming part of that risk network that RAIN has brought together.
And so for our audience, is it fair to say that you were involved in the intelligence community and just kind of leave it at that?
If it's all right with you, I'd like to leave it at that, but yes.
Okay, cool. That makes it even more interesting and engaging. And I noticed, you don't really have a social media presence, which is not a bad idea for, many of us, given all the hacking and everything that's going on, in the digital universe, to be sure. And so, what's pretty interesting is just the pace of change, and we're seeing so much changing in the digital universe, and it's happening so fast. And how this show came about was only yesterday. We saw that this report was released on foreign threats, to the 2020 U.S. Elections. And when I read about it, like everybody else, I said, man, this is important. We need to delve into this, and I'm so grateful for your insights because I remember when we were talking prior to the show, this is something that you said you're well aware of and everything, so that's cool. Wait, we have some breaking news here. For the purpose of the assessment, election influence includes overt and covert efforts by foreign governments or actors acting as agents of or on behalf of foreign governments. Wow. Like what does that mean?
So what we're talking about here is not necessarily foreign governments that are going to be doing these activities that we're concerned about, but rather they're using another term that we often talk about as proxies, people that are acting in their interests on their behalf that are not necessarily discrete government, say, officials. We're not talking about someone from the Ministry of Foreign Affairs doing this. We're talking about a private citizen, someone maybe even loosely affiliated with the government, and those are the kind of actors that we're speaking about.
And one of the things that I noticed from the report itself is there's really, or is it valid to say that there's really a consensus or unanimity, about the assessments that we're going to be delving into today's show? Is that accurate?
Overall, absolutely. And in fact, what we also saw that got a little less public attention, but the same day as this report came out, the Department of Justice and the Department of Homeland Security both together issued another joint report also confirming that they didn't observe any significant attempts or success at interfering in the elections. The one thing I would point out is buried in the report towards the end that came out from the National Intelligence Council. There is a little dissenting box from the National Intelligence Officer for Cyber, and this individual wanted to get across a view, and I think it's very commendable that in these type of documents we flag these opinions, essentially wanting to boost up a little more confidence that China did try to do some more influence activities than it admitted to. But other than that, there was strong consensus on basically all of the assessments. And it's particularly notable that for all of these, or for most of all of the assessments, they were made with high confidence. So it's not just that the intelligence community was determining these things, it was that they actually felt very strongly that they were correct in their assessments.
And this report was originally presented in early January, correct?
That's right. So it was actually done in pursuant to an executive order that former President Trump signed in 2018, saying that there would be within 45 days after the election a review of any attempts at foreign interference. And so pursuant to that, the National Intelligence Council, which is one of the arms of the Office of the Director of National Intelligence that oversees the intelligence community, got together all of the relevant agencies. And you can see at the top the various insignias to make this report. And it was presented to the then Trump administration back in January, and now is being publicly released.
One of the things that I found in reading it, and I really encourage our audience to pick it up, it's kind of everywhere, and we'll have it in our show notes, as well, of course, is the key judgments. It seemed to me, just as a citizen, really pretty easy to follow and to understand, and there were actually 5 key judgments, and, we're popping one of those up on the screen right now, which basically says that, what you said, that there's a big difference between influence and misinformation and disinformation and actually tampering with voting equipment, right? Is that true?
Absolutely. So the report makes a distinction between interference and influence. So influence being any sort of attempt to sway opinions that would therefore then lead to vote changes. Interference is actually being used to refer to the technical means to try to interfere with the voting process. So, for instance, actually changing ballots. And what's really notable that the report makes clear is while there were definite attempts at influence, there was no widespread attempt and certainly no success at actually technically interfering with the electoral count.
That's interesting. I'm putting out kind of our equivalent of a bat signal right now. And if anyone has a good idea for a signal for this, we'd like to hear from you. But we have rapid responders who are watching the show and, stand by and want to maybe opine on something. And everyone in our audience is unbelievably smart about so many different things. So there, I just put out our little bat signal. We'll see what happens with that in a little bit as we look to key judgment number 2, that essentially you're assessing that Russian President Putin was heavily involved in this. Is that the case?
Yeah, I mean, the key judgment is very direct and to the point. It says very clearly that the assessment is that the highest levels of the Russian government, to include President Putin himself, authorized, and then a variety of different agents, be they from the government or agents of influence, so these individuals that are not necessarily formal government members or entities, carried out an influence campaign that was notably aimed not only to denigrate then candidate Joe Biden, but also to support then President Trump. So it was actually working on two levels to both denigrate one candidate and amplify the chances of another.
Wow. And the timing of the release of this declassified version, what are your thoughts about that, if you can speak to that? If you can't, we certainly understand.
Well, I think there's always a lot of political incentive to make what can be shared with the public known, simply because it increases trust and legitimacy in our electoral process, and we want the public to know that what we went through in this particularly contested election was not fraudulent. We tragically saw on January 6th earlier this year that there's a lot of misinformation, disinformation about the state of the election in November. And obviously, given ongoing other issues, including, of course, the pandemic, broader social unrest, things of this nature, I think it's really important. And I think the intelligence community probably wanted to show that the public can have faith in our elections, that what we saw, despite the attempts of countries like Russia to try to influence the election, their actual ability and success to interfere in it came to nothing.
Yeah, and that's what Director Krebs, stated. I guess it would have been November. That this was the most secure election, and kind of in our history. What do you think the motivation is? Or what would your assessment be? The motivation is to kind of keep putting forth this. Some people refer to it as the big lie. About election fraud. Why would someone do that?
Well, what's notable here is I would say that there's a kind of a bit of a difference in narratives that we've seen. I think what you're talking about, Gary, is really coming from a domestic perspective of certain individuals, including, quite frankly, the former president, who put forward an idea that because of various things like mail-in voting, deliberate distortion by election officials, et cetera, that there was some sort of organized conspiracy to rig the election. What we're talking about in this report, while related, is a bit different, which is, of course, a foreign actor allegedly trying to conduct activities to sway the election. So they certainly dovetail together, but they are kind of born from two different allegations.
Indeed. And do you think that this is something that the U.S. does to our enemies as well?
I do think it's a little different. I think if you look historically, the United States absolutely has historically both interfered and influenced elections, including beginning after World War II. Most prominently, there's discussions of the U.S. essentially buying off Italian elections, for instance, to make sure that the Soviet Union's preferred communist candidates didn't win. So the U.S. has certainly been guilty of this. It's definitely not something, though, that we engage in this day in the same way, and certainly not in the ways that countries like Russia and China are trying to do. What's also notable, quite frankly, is the US is a democracy, so we are vulnerable to this. Most of our adversaries, even if they hold elections, are not truly democratic. So the incentive for the US to try to rig or influence the vote is almost irrelevant, because the vote itself is already not legitimate. The Chinese Communist Party doesn't exactly have free elections. President Vladimir Putin may ostensibly hold elections, but they are certainly not free nor fair. So the opportunity for the United States, even if it wanted to do these things, doesn't really exist.
Well, that's a really interesting insight. And speaking of interesting insights, I'm going to welcome one of our rapid responders. Hey, Scott, how you doing?
Hey, great to be here, guys. Good to see you, Gary. Good to see you, Sam.
Yeah, so you're a cyber expert. I can testify that is true about many, many things. What are your thoughts about what you've heard from Sam so far, and the couple, key judgments that we've discussed thus far?
Well, I think it is interesting, and I certainly concur in line with what Sam said and what the report brings out. 'Cause if we just go back a little bit to 2016, over time, they did learn about things that Russia did have active role in some of their cyber meddling, I guess you could say, in the election. Whether or not it caused a difference in the response or not, whether the way people voted, I don't think it changed anything. And if you go fast forward, the government really instilled a lot of good security measures on all the vulnerabilities in the whole voting process, doing the ballots and the mail-in and so on and so forth. And I don't think there was any type of problem that was discovered here as far as physical manipulation or changing, again, the election outcome. So to Sam's point in the report, there was no really cyber issues this present election that just happened. So that's a really good sign. That means money was well spent, things have improved. Although I would like to point out, with the focus on the election, where did Russia and cyber meddling take place? We look at the SolarWinds hack, one of the biggest hacks ever. That's where a lot of the energy went toward hacking in, and the effects are really United States, how we're all affected, the large companies and a lot of the government agencies too. So Russia is sneaky. They shifted their tactics a little bit this time, but did they cause more concern and problems with the media and possible influence and things that way? Yeah, absolutely, by different means, as the report well documents there. But it's interesting. It wasn't a focused technical attack with cyber this time. They mixed their game up, and that's a concern going forward. So I think it has to be looked at all different aspects. But overall, I think this election, one would certainly say from a cyber perspective, was much safer and was much more of a success.
Indeed. And Sam, just to build on the point regarding President Putin, it was just announced, I guess yesterday again, that the Russian ambassador to the United States is going to be called back because, from what I can tell, President Biden gave an interview, referring to or answering the question, is President Putin a, quote, killer, quote unquote, and the next day, the ambassador's going by. What do you think of that?
Yeah, so this is really just the latest point of escalation in an ongoing tit-for-tat series of recriminations between the two sides. The real immediate flashpoint for this has been the jailing of opposition leader Alexei Navalny in Russia. This is someone who is a very famous figure now globally, but particularly and historically in Russia, where he's been one of the few individuals who's been able to kind of mount some sort of widespread opposition to President Putin's rule. Last August, he was poisoned by a banned nerve agent, had to be medically evacuated to Germany, where he spent 5 months. It's since been documented very clearly, and the US has taken an official position on this, that it was Russian security services that tried to poison him. And when he returned back to Russia earlier this year, he was first detained and then put on trial for unrelated charges. Convicted, and he's now in jail. Since that time, you've seen the US and our partners in Europe impose some new sanctions, threaten new measures, and this is all, of course, occurring with, as Scott mentioned, the SolarWinds hack in the background. And President Biden and his top officials have been very, very clear that they, in quite frankly, the upcoming days or weeks, are going to be taking retaliation both unseen in the cyber realm and then also more publicly with the threats of new sanctions and other penalties on Russia. So this is really just the latest in a series of moves that are going to increase tensions between the two countries. And my understanding is right now the ambassador is going to be heading back on Saturday, and this could very well be kind of the start of the Kremlin's own tit-for-tat retaliation in some of the measures that they want to impose.
Indeed. And Scott, of course, when it comes to cyber conflict, which is really just the next kind of theater of war, or it's here, it's not the next, to be sure, this whole notion of hacking back, how does that work? Does it work? Because one of the things that I've always sort of been wondering about is, so we have some code and, we do something, we hack back, as it were, or have, I think, forward leaning, kind of offense, or there's sort of a lean in kind of view. Don't the enemies then get the code and can just use it against us again, or not?
Well, it really depends on the circumstances. And in some ways, a number of years ago, the U.S. kind of drew a line in the sand, in a sense, and really did one of the most notorious attacks, I guess, against Iran with Stuxnet, where it was very targeted against centrifuges there for nuclear enrichment and things. So, and that was kind of a cyber attack that I think set the stage. So some serious things can unfold if somebody does a very focused, targeted cyber attack. And I think what the U.S. is saying, hey, we're going to draw a line in the sand again. Russia, we're not going to put up with this anymore. And we will retaliate with both sanctions, and those are things that publicly we're going to see and hear, but then also behind the scenes with some cyber attacks that will be very targeted there, and that will disrupt Russia and send them a clear message. U.S. is not going to be putting up with this anymore. So I think there's some differentiations in the way that the response was written there against the Russians. But I think if you go back in history, the last X number of times there's been attacks, and this is again that originated from China, from Russia, and other nations, there's been very little that we've heard about or seen as far as retaliatory strikes from a cyber perspective. Now I think that the game is changing because the U.S. is saying no more of this game playing. That's it. Now there's going to be specific consequences if you keep doing this.
Mm-hmm. Do you want to add to that, Sam?
Yeah, I think it's very important to consider kind of the different ways in which countries are using the cyber realm. And, this is, going to really play down the vast majority, and complexity of these things. However, when you consider the kind of various options, the U.S. is trying to delineate between what it sees as kind of legitimate intelligence collection, i.e. those things that countries, whether we like to admit it or not, are persistently doing in the cyber domain, where they're trying to gather information of interest from foreign countries that they want to acquire. And what the U.S. is essentially saying to Russia is that the SolarWinds hack was indiscriminate, trying to pilfer so much information, trying to target a number of really what should not be accessed, private corporations and government agencies, et cetera, and trying to say that's unacceptable behavior. The, of course, ultimate form of unacceptable behavior would be a cyber attack that causes kinetic action in the real world. And this is where you start to really get concerned about things like attacking infrastructure, like power systems, hospitals. And we've seen some indications of that. Of course, as Scott mentioned, the prototypical attack that this showed was the Stuxnet attack, which had a real world effect in harming Iran's centrifuges. We haven't seen anything like that repeated, but the U.S. is certainly worried, and there have been plenty of media articles about this, that Russia and potentially other cyber actors like China or Iran do have the capability, even if they, of course, haven't deployed it, to potentially harm our critical infrastructure. And so the real concern from the U.S. is, where does this end? If Russia is willing to do this and they have these accesses, what else might they have access to, and what else might they do if we don't put our foot down?
Indeed, and that's the key judgment, number 3 that you're beginning to allude to, pertaining, to Iran. How else would you, if you can again say publicly, assess, Iran, and were they successful at kind of this disinformation and sowing division? Is there data that points to that?
Again, the report seems to make quite clear that despite Iran's attempts, it did not have any real significant impact. Now, the report does make clear that it's not explicitly assessing whether or not there was sustained impact, because as the report correctly notes, the job of foreign-facing intelligence agencies isn't to monitor kind of U.S. domestic political events for a variety of reasons, most of which, and most importantly, are legal ones. We don't want them assessing our own politics. However, what you saw from Iran was definitely sustained attempts at influence, but ones that really seem to have backfired. And the one that's worth raising, that's highlighted in the report, is Iran tried to impersonate members of the group, the Proud Boys, to send threatening messages to Democratic voters, encouraging them to vote for Trump. And this was kind of a way of psychological warfare, so to speak, that really backfired on them when these became public, that it was really Iran that was doing this.
And were there consequences for that?
There may have been consequences that we don't know about in the classified realm. Obviously couldn't speak to that. I don't know. It seems to me that Iran has tried this before. To be honest, their tradecraft seems to be pretty sloppy because we read about it quite a lot in the news. And if news agencies are writing about it, that means it is inherently not any more clandestine, which means it's probably not that effective. So, Iran can attempt to manipulate social media as much as it would like, but if it is continually coming out in the press that it's really a bunch of Iranians behind these fake accounts, it's not going to be all that effective.
And just to build on that point a little bit, Scott, Section 230 for our audience is, legislation that essentially gives blanket protection to the platforms like, Facebook and Twitter and all that, that they're not really responsible for the content, on their sites. I actually counted; it's only 26 words, which is just this monster societal, consequence. What do you think about that, Scott? I mean, is legislation coming that is going to add some different words to those 26?
Yeah, I think so, and that's a hard one, and that's a big battle to get that forth, especially with big tech companies and big data. And this has been an ongoing battle back and forth, and you hear a lot of different stances when you look at a company like Apple and then contrast that with Facebook or Microsoft or Google. They all have a little bit different position upon that, and as far as censorship and what should be out there and shouldn't be out there. So I think clearer legislation has to be put forth, and I think everybody has to buy into it and agree upon what is acceptable and what is not acceptable. And I think a fair amount of that is actually going to come about with not just people and opinions, but also the technology behind it, because the ability to censor and control a lot of this information is really done behind the scenes with artificial intelligence.
Yes.
There's not enough manpower to really properly do it. So that's a bigger topic, and I think more technology that's going to support ultimate legislation here.
Yeah, coincidentally, we just last week did a show on artificial intelligence that was based on the report to Congress pertaining to the I think it was the National Security Commission on artificial intelligence, and it was a 756-page report. So, AI has monster, implications, including with something I think that kind of underpins what we're talking about, which is a question of values. In you said earlier, Sam, in terms of values and freedom and democracy and elections, we kind of are pretty unique compared to the rest of the world. Is that fair?
Well, it's certainly something I hope we are. What you can definitely see from the new Biden administration is they are putting a premium on rebuilding alliances, rebuilding world trust and legitimacy in the United States as a moral power, and that without being critical of the former president is certainly something that at least the Biden administration is trying to present as a distinguishing feature, that they are going to move forward on promoting the U.S. as a moral and values-based player. And President Biden has even said that we don't want people to be in awe of our military power only, but also the power of our morals. And that's a really powerful statement that can bring together a lot of Western democratic countries and bring back some of the alliances and friendships that we've had with foreign countries that have suffered in the past 4 years because the United States did not take its as seriously fundamental values that it ostensibly likes to uphold, human rights, etc.
Indeed. And the fourth judgment was pertaining to China that, as you said earlier, didn't really deploy any efforts. They thought about it, but they didn't do it. And this is incredibly timely because, if I'm not mistaken, we're meeting with China, I think, in Alaska. Is that today or it's coming up? It is today. So are we going to get a scoop? Can you give us a scoop? We've never had a scoop. Come on.
I wish I could. It would be very fun to be a fly on that wall, but I've got nothing to offer.
Indeed. So is this your assessment? I mean, because there was a lot of discord pertaining who, if anyone, was meddling in the election. It was said, by the previous administration, it was, China, but this assessment says pretty dramatically otherwise.
Yeah, you're absolutely right. This is, a lot of the media attention has rightfully focused on the main point of the assessment, which is regarding Russia and its activities. However, this is actually a really, really key point because, as you noted, before the election, there was a lot of questions about potentially politicization of intelligence by top officials in the Trump administration, suggesting that Russia was not really the concern and it was actually more Iran and China, or at a minimum that Iran and China rose up to the level of Russia. And what this judgment makes very clear is that not only did China not do these things, but that Iran, while it certainly did engage in some of this behavior, did not rise up to the level by any means of what Russia attempted.
And as we come to our last key judgment, wow, everybody, has trouble with us. What did we do wrong, or what are we doing right?
Yeah, this is unsurprising. Of course, the capabilities of a jihadist, or excuse me, a militant Shiite group like Hezbollah, the small countries like Cuba and Venezuela, their capabilities, of course, are vastly below perhaps their aspirations to affect the election outcome. However, there are notable little strings that they can pull. They can try to sow divisions. They can try to take advantage of some sympathetic communities in the United States, particularly regarding, say, Cuba. They like to at least make an attempt to do the little that they can. And of course, I'm sure there are other countries, potential terrorist groups, even other entities that tried to do very small things. But what the report makes clear is that these were really meaningless efforts that show a lot more, perhaps, aspiration than any real capability to do anything.
Indeed. And it was just released today, kind of a follow-on report pertaining to domestic terrorism, put out by the intelligence community that basically has concluded that race-related violence is a big threat. And unfortunately, we had a vivid example of that yesterday with the brutal murder of a bunch of folks in Atlanta that were 6 of them were Asian. What does that mean, for the future of the country, Scott? How do we combat that?
Wow, not my area of expertise, but I think clearly I see there's a divide in this country, this nation. There's still a lot of hatred. I think there's not enough unity here, and there's not enough patience between people, and that is I think a tremendous concern. And if I could just make one comment on your points, I thought it was very interesting about other countries and threats to United States' national security. I think back, the threats used to often be bullets and guns and missiles and nuclear. And now I think the shift is really towards cyber threats, and small countries with very little capital or capability can easily hire hackers. And it could be a nation state sponsored hack against a very large country such as the United States. And as Sam pointed out, which is a very important point, about if they're targeting critical infrastructure and things like that, that could be extremely damaging. We saw what happened just recently with some of the power and the grid problems in Texas. Imagine if it's a targeted attack by some small enemy of the United States, but using cyber weapons to attack. That could be catastrophic. So I think going forward, I think the United States, and from a national security perspective, really needs to closely monitor and look at things as they are doing, and almost anticipate some of these things, especially after seeing what happened with the recent SolarWinds mess.
Indeed, and there's a kind of a Department of Defense, but federal government-wide effort, CMMC, cybersecurity maturity model certifications, which is the Department of Defense initiative to hold vendors accountable. They have 300,000 or more, and there are these 5 layers of kind of certification, and the higher you go in terms of meeting requirements, the more opportunity you have for, larger and better business. We're going to do a show on that tomorrow, I just decided, at 1:00. So everyone stay tuned for that. If we have someone listening right now who considers themselves to be expert in CMMC, we send me a note at Gary@cyberheroescomics.com. And as we're wrapping up, Sam, is there something else you'd like to say to our audience? And I'm going to show the beginning of a little video about RAIN. It's super cool. These folks are fantastic.
Sure, I'll let you show the video first, and maybe I can wrap up thereafter.
Okay, here we go. And so we'll pause there. Where can people go to see the rest of that interview and learn more about your organization?
Sure, so they can go to rainnetwork.com. They can go to stratfor.com. They can search us online, both sites, and we would love to connect with more people.
And I can testify to our audience. This, I think, is the third speaker that we've had from RAIN, and I'm sure you'll all agree they're all awesome. And these are very well experienced and incredibly wonderful unsung heroes who toil in anonymity to keep us safe at work and home, at school. And speaking of that, Scott, you have any final words for our audience?
I just want to thank you again for the time and a nice platform. Keep up the great work that you're doing there, Gary, and everybody else out there. Don't have to live in fear. Realize there's a lot of great companies such as Sam's there that are people doing things behind the scenes, and we're trying to keep working together, the good guys, educating people and fighting against cyber criminals. So hope is not lost.
Yeah, I agree. I mean, that's one of the amazing things that I've noticed in my sort of Forrest Gump journey into cybersecurity is that there are untold numbers of great people that no one hears about, because the only time you hear about cybercrime is when the hackers win. Well, not anymore. Thanks to our special guests, Sam and Scott, and thanks to all of you, the unsung cyber heroes in the audience. Stay tuned. If there's someone out there that wants to sponsor our show, we're starting to get some inquiries, so feel free to send me a note. My wife would really be grateful for that, and I won't have to use this tool to try to make her laugh, because this doll says,
"Let's go see that chick flick again. Good morning. I've made you breakfast in bed again."
So this alter ego of mine, my sidekick, has kept me out of hot water as I set up the studio in our living room. And but when you're on a mission, you stay with it. So again, on behalf of a Grateful Digital Universe, thanks so much, and we'll see you guys soon.